che in questi ultimi tempi sono accaduti sia a Roma che in Vaticano. Vi chiedo perdono.
Hear that? That was from Pope Francis himself. The Vatican is supposed to be the holiest place on earth, a sanctuary of silence, order, and divine authority, which is exactly why no one expected this. Because when information about what's really been happening behind those ancient walls got leaked, it went viral. And now, it's changing everything we thought we knew about the Vatican. Scandals hidden inside the Vatican. Within the sacred walls of Vatican City, a truth has persisted throughout its long history. Nothing stays hidden forever. Since Pope Francis assumed the papacy in March 2013, a series of explosive revelations have rocked the Catholic Church, exposing financial mismanagement, sexual abuse, and corruption at the highest levels of church leadership. Perhaps the most significant financial scandal to emerge during Francis's papacy involved Cardinal Angelo Becciu, once one of the most powerful figures in the Vatican. The scandal centered on a disastrous $400 million investment in London luxury real estate that resulted in losses exceeding €100 million for the Vatican. This wasn't ordinary investment money. These were funds from Peter's Pence, donations given by ordinary Catholics specifically intended for charitable works. Becciu had approved a €200 million investment with financier Raffaele Mincione in 2014, who allegedly misused the funds for other ventures, creating a financial catastrophe. The investigation uncovered deeper corruption. Becciu had allegedly funneled €250,000 to his brother's Spies cooperative in Sardinia, with Italian police finding forged receipts to cover the paper trail. He directed another €575,000 to a self-styled security consultant named Cecilia Marogna, supposedly for negotiating the release of a kidnapped nun, but the money was instead spent on luxury handbags and stays at five-star hotels. Stark betrayal of the church's mission to serve the poor. When confronted with these accusations, Becciu claimed absolute innocence and insisted Pope Francis had approved the London property deal. The Pope not only denied this claim, but took the extraordinary step of waiving Vatican state secrecy rules to allow testimony about their private conversations, virtually unprecedented in church history. In a particularly brazen move, Becciu secretly recorded a phone call with Pope Francis while the pontiff was recovering from colon surgery in 2021, violating both Vatican law and basic ethics. He also attempted to buy back the London property to halt the investigation, actions Francis deemed highly suspicious. The trial, which began in 2021, was historic. Cardinal Becciu became the highest-ranking church official ever to face judgment from lay judges in the Vatican's criminal court. In December 2023, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 5.5 years in prison, marking the first time a cardinal was tried by lay judges in the Vatican's criminal court. Though Becciu maintains his innocence and is appealing the verdict, the case demonstrates both the depth of financial corruption within the Vatican and Francis's determination to address it, despite resistance. The Becciu scandal emerged against a backdrop of long-standing financial problems at the Vatican. The Institute for Religious Works, IOR, commonly known as the Vatican Bank, had been plagued by scandals for decades. During World War II, the IOR reportedly received church taxes from Nazi Germany and was involved in hiding wartime loot, with estimates of $1.7 billion in transactions in 1943 alone. In 1982, the Vatican Bank was implicated in one of Italy's biggest financial scandals when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, leaving a $3.26 billion deficit. As the bank's largest shareholder, the Vatican paid a $244 million settlement while denying direct responsibility. Allegations of money laundering continued for decades, with suspicious transactions prompting investigations by the Bank of Italy in 2010 and causing JP Morgan to close an IOR account in 2012. The Vatican has also faced accusations of tax evasion, having allegedly avoided €4 billion in taxes on its extensive property holdings by exploiting a legal loophole. The European Court of Justice later ruled this practice illegal, potentially exposing the Vatican to liabilities up to €13 billion. These financial scandals were further exposed in what insiders dubbed Vatileaks 2.0, a scandal that erupted in 2015 when confidential documents were leaked to journalists. Two Italian journalists, Gianluigi Nuzzi and Emiliano Fittipaldi, published explosive books based on these documents. Nuzzi's Merchants in the Temple and Fittipaldi's Avarice detailed how Vatican officials mismanaged funds and fought against financial reforms. These revelations were particularly damaging because they came from within. Monsignor Lucio Vallejo Balda and Francesca Ciauchi, members of a papal commission established to recommend financial reforms, were arrested for leaking the documents. The Vatican's response was swift and severe. In a trial that attracted international attention, Balda was sentenced to 18 months in prison, while the journalists were acquitted on freedom of expression grounds. The scandal exposed a bitter struggle that some Vatican observers described as a battle between good and evil within the sacred halls of the Church's headquarters. Pope Francis, visibly shaken by these revelations, did something unusual for a pontiff. He issued a public apology.
Ma guai all'uomo a causa del quale viene lo scandalo. Io vorrei, prima di iniziare la catechesi, in nome della Chiesa, chiedervi perdono per gli scandali che in questi ultimi tempi sono caduti sia a Roma che in Vaticano. Vi chiedo perdono.
While financial scandals dominated headlines, the most devastating controversies during Francis's papacy involved sexual abuse. Perhaps none was more troubling than the case of Father Marco Rupnik, a world-renowned Jesuit artist whose mosaics adorn churches globally, including in the Vatican itself. Rupnik stands accused of sexual, psychological, and spiritual abuse against multiple women, primarily from the Loyola community in Slovenia. The allegations are harrowing. At least 9 women and 1 man have come forward with claims dating back to the 1980s and 1990s. A former religious sister known as Anna detailed 9 years of abuse, including manipulation and sexual acts Rupnik framed as spiritual expressions, telling her they represented the relationship between God and the Church. The Church's handling of the case raised serious questions. Rupnik was briefly excommunicated in 2019 for absolving an accomplice in a sexual sin, essentially granting religious forgiveness to a woman with whom he had engaged in sexual activity, a serious canonical crime. Yet this excommunication was lifted after just 2 weeks. Despite the growing allegations, Rupnik was allowed to preach to the Roman Curia in 2020 and meet Pope Francis in 2022, fueling perceptions of preferential treatment. Only after significant public pressure did the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, conduct a thorough investigation, finding 15 accusations highly credible. Rupnik was finally expelled from the Jesuits in 2023 for refusing to obey orders. Pope Francis, responding to mounting criticism, lifted the statute of limitations in October 2023, allowing the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith to investigate fully. As of 2025, the case remains active, with new victims coming forward as recently as 2024. The Rupnik case exemplifies what critics see as a pattern in the Church's response to abuse allegations. Initial reluctance to act decisively, followed by stronger measures only after public pressure. When questioned about the Church's handling of sexual abuse cases, Pope Francis acknowledged the scale of the problem while promising continued action.
Unfortunately, the tragedy of the abuses is enormous. And against this, an upright conscience. And not only to not permit it, but to put in place the conditions so that it does not happen.
You have said zero tolerance.
It cannot be tolerated.
In January 2025, Francis demonstrated this commitment by dissolving the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, SCV, a Peru-based Catholic religious community with approximately 20,000 members worldwide. Founded by Luis Fernando Figari in 1971, the group had been under scrutiny since 2017, when an investigation found Figari and other members had abused 19 minors and 10 adults. Unlike similar cases, such as the Legionaries of Christ, which was merely restructured under Pope Benedict XVI despite widespread abuse allegations, Francis ordered the complete dissolution of the SCV, essentially disbanding the organization entirely. This unprecedented action demonstrated a willingness to take dramatic steps when necessary, though critics note it came after years of allegations and investigations. Another controversy that shook the Vatican was the Papal Foundation scandal of 2017. This US-based Catholic charity found itself at the center of a storm when Cardinal Donald called Whirl, provided misleading information to secure a $25 million grant for a scandal-ridden Rome hospital, the Istituto Dermopatico dell'Immacolata, IDI. The Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, requested the grant on behalf of Pope Francis, but critical details were omitted. The hospital was already bankrupt due to earlier embezzlement scandals, and the grant would essentially bail out the Vatican Bank, which had made a bad loan to the facility. When Foundation members discovered these omissions, many objected, creating a rift that damaged the organization's credibility and raised questions about transparency at the highest levels of church leadership. When Pope Francis began his papacy in 2013, he inherited what his autobiography, Spera, Hope, later revealed as a large white box of documents from Benedict XVI, containing evidence of difficult and painful situations, abuse, corruption, and wrongdoings that his predecessor had begun to address. Benedict's parting words were ominous. "Everything is in here. I have arrived this far, taken these actions, removed these people. Now it's your turn." This symbolic passing of the torch, or perhaps more accurately, the passing of a ticking time bomb, set the stage for Francis's tumultuous papacy. The scandals that followed would test his reform agenda and at times threaten to overshadow his broader spiritual mission. In response to these challenges, Francis implemented significant reforms. In 2014, he established the Secretariat for the Economy, appointing Cardinal George Pell as its first prefect, with a mandate to bring transparency and accountability to Vatican finances. Francis also reformed the Vatican Bank, closing thousands of suspicious accounts and implementing stricter anti-money laundering protocols. However, these reform efforts faced significant internal resistance. The Vatileaks 2.0 scandal of 2015 revealed the extent of this opposition when confidential documents were leaked to journalists Gianluigi Nuzzi and Emiliano Fittipaldi. Their subsequent books detailed how Vatican officials mismanaged funds and actively resisted financial reforms. The Pope's crusade against financial corruption and abuse came at a great personal cost. As his health declined in his final years, Francis continued to push for accountability despite growing physical frailty. But his reforms and progressive approach would make him powerful enemies within and outside the Church, setting the stage for unprecedented opposition to a sitting pontiff and creating divisions that would persist beyond his lifetime. Powerful forces against Pope Francis. As Pope Francis labored to reform the Vatican's finances and address the Church's deep-seated abuse problems, a powerful coalition of critics emerged to oppose him. This opposition came not just from expected quarters, conservative cardinals resistant to change, but from a diverse alliance of traditionalist Catholics, political figures, media personalities, and even those implicated in the very scandals he sought to address. Within the Catholic Church hierarchy, several high-ranking clerics became Francis's most vocal critics, often challenging his theological and administrative decisions through formal channels. Cardinal Raymond Burke, an American known for his traditionalist views, emerged as a leading opponent, submitting formal questions, dubia, to Pope Francis in 2016 and 2023, seeking clarification on teachings related to marriage, same-sex unions, and synodality. These questions were not merely academic inquiries, but thinly veiled challenges to Francis's authority and theological positions. Burke wasn't alone in his opposition. Cardinal Walter Brandmüller of Germany joined him in the dubious submissions, openly criticizing Francis for organizing events that allegedly limited open discussion among cardinals. Cardinal Robert Serra of Guinea, another traditionalist with significant influence, became part of the 2023 Dubia group and frequently expressed concerns about Francis's reforms, particularly on liturgical matters. These cardinals viewed Francis's more pastoral approach, especially regarding divorced and remarried Catholics receiving communion, as a dangerous departure from traditional doctrine that threatened the very foundations of Catholic teaching. The opposition extended well beyond the College of Cardinals into the broader theological community. In 2019, a group of 19 theologians, including the respected Dominican Frater Aidan Nichols, signed an open letter to the world's bishops, making the extraordinary accusation that Pope Francis had committed the canonical delict of heresy for his teachings on marriage, sexuality, and grace. This unprecedented charge against a sitting pope followed a 2017 filial correction signed by over 60 priests and scholars, alleging that Francis upheld 7 heretical positions, demonstrating a level of open dissent that would have been unthinkable under previous pontificates. Traditional Catholic groups intensified the opposition to Francis's agenda. The Society of St. Pius X, SSPX, which has historically opposed Vatican II reforms, found Francis's continuation and expansion of those reforms particularly troubling. Though the SSPX criticized the 2019 open letter letter accusing Francis of heresy as excessive, their broader critique of his papacy aligned with traditionalist concerns about doctrine and liturgy. Francis's 2021 restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass, as outlined in Traditionis Custodes, further fueled opposition from these groups, who saw it as a direct attack on their liturgical heritage and an attempt to suppress traditionalist expressions of Catholicism. Perhaps no critic was more outspoken or controversial than Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, once the Vatican's ambassador to the United States. In 2018, Vigano published an explosive 11-page letter accusing Francis of knowing about sexual abuse allegations against Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and failing to act, dramatically calling for the Pope's resignation, an unprecedented demand from a former papal nuncio. Following this initial salvo, Vigano went into hiding, claiming he feared for his safety, and continued his attacks from an undisclosed location. As time passed, Vigano's rhetoric grew increasingly apocalyptic. He escalated his accusations, branding Francis a false prophet and servant of Satan, while claiming the Pope was promoting a globalist agenda and actively undermining Catholic tradition. The Archbishop even went so far as to reject the legitimacy of the Second Vatican Council, positioning himself as a defender of a pre-conciliar church untainted by modernism. In 2024, Vigano's rebellion reached its inevitable conclusion when he was formally excommunicated for schism after explicitly refusing to recognize Francis's legitimacy as Pope, marking one of the most dramatic ecclesiastical punishments in recent Catholic history. Catholic media figures also played a significant role in amplifying opposition to Francis. Michael Voris, founder of the controversial media platform Church Militant, frequently criticized Francis for statements perceived as defying Catholic teaching, such as his remarks on homosexual unions and economic justice. Voris's platform became increasingly influential among conservative Catholics, providing a relentless megaphone for dissenting voices and regularly portraying Francis as a threat to authentic Catholicism. The reach of Church Militant extended far beyond traditional Catholic media, creating an ecosystem of anti-Francis sentiment that shaped perceptions, particularly in the United States. This influence continued until Voris himself experienced a dramatic downfall, resigning in 2023 after violating Church Militant's morality clause, an ironic conclusion for someone who had built a career critiquing others' moral failings. Opposition to Francis extended well beyond the religious sphere into mainstream politics, particularly in the United States. Donald Trump and Francis had a notoriously contentious relationship dating back to 2016, when the Pope suggested Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric was not Christian. Trump responded with uncharacteristic fury directed at a religious leader, calling Francis disgraceful and suggesting the Vatican would regret not having him as president to protect it from ISIS, comments that shocked many observers for their disrespect toward a major religious figure. This feud was not merely a clash of personalities, but represented fundamental disagreements about immigration, economic justice, and environmental policy. The antagonism continued through Trump's second term, with Francis condemning Trump's mass deportation plans as a disgrace and major crisis in early 2025, just months before the Pope's death. Secular conservative commentators also contributed significantly to the anti-Francis narrative, bringing criticisms of the pontiff to mainstream audiences beyond Catholic circles. Ross Douthat of the New York Times emerged as one of the most articulate and influential critics, developing a comprehensive case against Francis in his 2018 book To Change the Church. Unlike more inflammatory critics, Douthat presented his concerns in measured, intellectual terms, arguing that the Pope's reforms risked dividing the Church into irreconcilable factions. His critiques focused on Francis's handling of marriage, divorce, and economic issues, suggesting that the Pope was undermining essential Catholic doctrines in pursuit of popularity and progressive approval. What drove this intense opposition to Francis? The critics themselves cited various concerns, but several key themes emerged that transformed typical disagreement into unprecedented hostility toward a sitting pontiff. Theological disagreements formed the core of much opposition. Critics argued that Francis's reforms, particularly allowing communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, as suggested in his apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia, undermined traditional doctrine on marriage. They viewed his relatively welcoming approach toward LGBTQ+ Catholics as a dangerous departure from church teaching on sexuality, pointing to instances where Francis appeared to endorse civil unions for same-sex couples as evidence of doctrinal confusion or deliberate subversion of Catholic teaching. Liturgical changes, especially restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass, alienated traditionalist Catholics who favored pre-Vatican II practices. Francis's 2021 motu proprio Traditionis Custodes reversed his predecessor's more permissive approach, limiting where and when the old rite could be celebrated. For many traditionalists, this decision represented not just a policy disagreement, but an attack on what they considered the most beautiful and authentic expression of Catholic worship, fueling resentment that transcended ordinary ecclesiastical politics. Political stances on issues like immigration, climate change, and capitalism alienated conservative political figures and commentators. Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si called for urgent action on climate change, while his critiques of unfettered capitalism and advocacy for migrants put him at odds with right-wing politicians globally. His statement that building walls instead of bridges was not Christian was widely interpreted as a direct rebuke of Trump's border policies, inserting the papacy into partisan political debates in unprecedented ways. His handling of sexual abuse cases drew criticism from across the political spectrum. Allegations that Francis mishandled specific cases, like those involving McCarrick and Chilean Bishop Juan Barros, fueled skepticism about his commitment to accountability, even as he took stronger actions later in his papacy. His initial dismissal of accusations against Barros as calumny during a 2018 trip to Chile, before later apologizing and accepting Barros's resignation, created an impression of inconsistency that damaged his credibility on abuse issues. Perceived ambiguity in Francis's statements troubled critics who preferred the clear doctrinal pronouncements of previous popes. They accused Francis of making vague or contradictory statements that confused the faithful, pointing to his famous "Who am I to judge?" comment about gay priests as an example of rhetoric that seemed to undermine established teaching while maintaining plausible deniability about doctrinal changes. The intensity of this opposition was amplified by the proliferation of media platforms and social media, particularly in the United States, where conservative Catholic networks gained significant followings that would have been impossible in previous generations. Traditional Catholic publications like the National Catholic Register increasingly aligned with critics of Francis, while newer digital platforms like Church Militant could reach millions of viewers with limited editorial oversight. The echo chamber effect of social media allowed like-minded critics to reinforce each other's views, creating the impression of widespread opposition that may have been disproportionate to actual sentiment among ordinary Catholics. Pope Francis himself acknowledged this organized criticism, describing conservative opponents as having a suicidal attitude for clinging to rigid ideologies rather than engaging with the modern world. When asked about his conservative critics, particularly in the United States, Francis offered this assessment.
You used an adjective, conservative. That is, conservative is one who clings to something and does not want to see beyond that. It is a suicidal attitude. Because one thing is to take tradition into account, to consider situations from the past, but quite another is to be closed up inside a dogmatic box.
Public reactions to Francis and the scandals plaguing his papacy varied widely across the spectrum of Catholic opinion. On social media platforms like Reddit, users expressed strong and diverse perspectives that reflected the polarization within the Church. One user, Jatak33, wrote with evident frustration, "This is what throws me. Any other pope would not be able to cover for and defend the amount of evil men that Francis has without media coverage. Inzoli, Barros, Zanchetta, Rupnik, McCarrick, etc." This comment, which received significant engagement from other users, encapsulated the view held by many conservative Catholics that Francis had been protected from appropriate scrutiny by a sympathetic secular media. Other Reddit users offered more pessimistic assessments of Francis's long-term legacy. A user identified as PhD Survivor commented, "I am afraid our current pontiff will not be kindly remembered by the faithful in the future." This prediction about Francis's historical standing revealed a perception among some Catholics that his papacy would be judged harshly by future generations, comparing him unfavorably to more traditional predecessors. Meanwhile, some users saw accusations against Francis as politically motivated attempts to undermine reform. A Reddit user with the handle Stag Lee pointedly questioned allegations that Francis covered up abuse, writing, "But the moment Francis is like, okay, no, seriously, enough is enough, we're not hiding you pedos anymore." This archbishop comes out of the woodwork. The polarized reaction to Francis extended to his handling of specific scandals, with each new revelation or response becoming a battleground for competing visions of the Church. Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, became such an outspoken critic of Francis's leadership and doctrinal positions that he was removed from his diocese in 2023, a remarkably rare and extreme measure indicating how how fraught the relationship between Francis and his conservative critics had become. Strickland had repeatedly used social media to criticize Francis's positions, particularly regarding the blessing of same-sex couples, portraying the Pope as betraying authentic Catholic teaching in favor of secular values. Even as Francis worked to address major scandals like the Becciu financial corruption case and the dissolution of the abuse-ridden Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, each action generated fresh controversy among his critics and defenders. Those who supported Francis saw a pope courageously confronting entrenched corruption and abuse despite fierce internal resistance, highlighting his unprecedented willingness to prosecute a cardinal and disband a compromised religious order. Critics, however, perceived inconsistency, favoritism, and an unwillingness to hold certain allies accountable, pointing to delays in addressing the Rupnik case and the initial defense of Chilean Bishop Barros. One anonymous Vatican official was quoted by religious affairs journalist John Allen saying, "Francis wants transparency, but only on his terms. He'll expose his enemies and protect his friends, just like any politician." This perception, whether fair or not, significantly damaged Francis's reputation as a reformer and played into the hands of those who accused him of hypocrisy and selectively applying accountability. Critics pointed to his 2023 remarks, urging Vatican auditors to balance transparency with merciful discretion in handling corruption as evidence of an inconsistent approach that undermined genuine reform efforts. In his final years as Pope, Francis appeared to increasingly embrace this challenge. His 2021-2023 Synod on Synodality, a global consultation process designed to make the Church more inclusive and participatory, represented an effort to shift from a monarchical model of leadership to a more collaborative approach. As Francis's health declined and opposition to his leadership intensified, Vatican observers increasingly questioned what would happen after his papacy ended. Would his reforms endure, or would they be quickly undone by a conservative successor? And perhaps most importantly, how would the Church address the deep divisions that had emerged during his tenure? These questions would soon take on urgent importance as events rapidly unfolded in the spring of 2025. Francis's death transforms Vatican future. As the early morning light streamed through the windows of the Apostolic Palace on April 21, 2025, Vatican officials received shocking news that would forever alter the course of Catholic history. Pope Francis had died at the age of 88. The announcement came from the Vatican press office with deep sorrow, noting that at 7:35 that morning, the Bishop of Rome had returned to the house of the Father.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, con profondo dolore devo annunciare la morte del nostro Santo Padre Francesco. Alle ore 7:35 di questa mattina, il Vescovo di Roma Francesco è tornato alla casa del Padre. La sua vita tutta intera è stata dedicata al servizio del Signore e della sua Chiesa.
Francis's death marked the end of a papacy defined by bold reform efforts, global advocacy for the marginalized, and persistent scandals that tested both his leadership and the Church's credibility. In the hours and days that followed, Catholics and non-Catholics alike reflected on his complex legacy, a pope who championed mercy and simplicity while struggling to fully address the institutional failures that had eroded trust in the Church he led. The final years of Francis's papacy had been marked by declining health and increasing frailty. In March 2025, just weeks before his death, the Pope had been hospitalized with double pneumonia, raising concerns about his ability to continue leading the Church. From his hospital bed, he had released an audio message thanking the faithful for their prayers and support, his voice noticeably weaker, but his spirit undimmed.
Ogni volta che io entro in questi posti mi domando perché loro e non io.
Che cosa è per lei questa Pasqua così complicata dopo il ricovero? Come la vive?
Come posso. E la vivo come posso. Andiamo.
Even in his final Easter message, delivered by an aide due to his weakened condition, Francis maintained his focus on global conflicts and human suffering, showing his commitment to addressing broader social justice issues even as his body failed.
Sono vicino alle sofferenze dei cristiani in Palestina e in Israele, così come a tutto il popolo israeliano e a tutto il popolo palestinese. Preoccupa il crescente clima di antisemitismo che si va diffondendo in tutto il mondo. In pari tempo il mio pensiero va alla popolazione e in modo particolare alla comunità cristiana di Gaza.
With Francis's death, the Catholic Church entered a period known as the sede vacante, or vacant seat, a time of transition and uncertainty as the College of Cardinals prepared to elect his successor. The coming conclave would shape the Church's direction for years to come, with significant implications for ongoing reform efforts, scandal management, and the global Catholic community of 1.37 billion members. Several key concerns dominated discussions about the Church's future as Vatican observers and Catholic faithful contemplated what would come next. The most pressing question centered on whether the next pope would continue Francis's progressive reforms or chart a more conservative course. Although Francis had appointed the majority of cardinal electors, suggesting his influence would extend beyond his lifetime, the secret nature of conclave deliberations made the outcome unpredictable and left many wondering if his reform agenda would survive. Equally important was how the next pontiff would address the lingering scandals that had plagued the Church. The Becciu conviction and ongoing Rupnik case required continued attention, while broader issues of financial transparency and abuse prevention remained unresolved despite Francis's efforts. The incoming pope would need to demonstrate both commitment to accountability and skill in institutional reform to restore trust among the faithful. Many Vatican insiders worry whether the next pope would heal the divisions that had intensified during Francis's tenure. The polarization between progressive and traditionalist Catholics had reached unprecedented levels, threatening the Church's unity and effectiveness at a time when religious influence was already declining in many parts of the world. Finding common ground between these factions would require extraordinary diplomatic skills. The field of potential successors to Francis includes several strong contenders, each representing different visions for the Church's future. The age and health of potential candidates would be critical considerations given Francis's experience. He was 76 when elected and served until 88, facing health challenges that limited his activities in his final years. Many cardinals expressed private concerns about electing another elderly pope, potentially favoring someone younger like Cardinal Tagle, who could provide longer-term stability and leadership. However, others argued that an older, transitional figure might be preferable to allow time for the Church to process Francis's reforms before making additional significant changes. Whatever choice is made, the hope remains that it will bring unity, wisdom, and strength to the Catholic Church and to the world it continues to influence. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.